To the Cannon Beach Library's Northwest Author Speaker Series. My name is Phyllis Byrne, and I'm a library volunteer. Today, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce J.A. Jance. Ms. Jance has spoken at the library before when she was on vacation on the North Coast. We are delighted that, despite the pandemic, she's able to join us today from Seattle, thanks to the wonders of Zoom and Facebook Live. J.A. Jance is the top 10 New York Times bestselling author of more than 60 novels and novellas, as well as the poetry collection After the Fire. While most authors find it challenging enough to successfully write one series of novels, J.A. Jance is the author of 4 series. The novels centering on retired Seattle police detective J.P. Beaumont, the series focusing on Cochise County Sheriff Joanna Brady, the novels featuring former news anchor Allie Reynolds and the Walker family mysteries. And she's able to keep all 4 series fresh and engaging. Full disclosure, I especially enjoy Joanna Brady, maybe because we're both short. J.A. Jance was born in Watertown, South Dakota, and raised in Brisbane, Arizona. She received a scholarship to the University of Arizona, where she earned a bachelor's in English and secondary education, and then a master's degree in library science. The university awarded her an honorary doctorate in the year 2000. In 2018, she received the Strand Magazine Lifetime Achievement Award as one of the finest practitioners of the suspenseful thriller. Before pursuing a career as a writer, she was a librarian on the Tohono O'odham Native American Reservation, a teacher, and an insurance agent. She began to write while she was a divorced single parent and full-time insurance agent, carving out time between 4 and 7 in the morning to write. Fortunately for all of us, she has been writing ever since. Please join me in welcoming J.A. Jance.
Well, thank you, Phyllis. I'm very glad to be here. It's it's odd to be in Seattle when I would rather be in that lovely auditorium in Cannon Beach. I usually get to go to Cannon Beach with our daughter and our grandson, so it's a real family vacation. But we're doing the best we can, and that's the way it is. When I do a live event, I generally don't take questions because with hearing aids, yes, I'm a woman of a certain age, with hearing aids, it's almost impossible to hear the question. And if I don't hear the question, I will give some off-the-wall answer that has nothing to do with the question, and then people just think I'm stupid. So I've been at Cannon Beach before, and I suppose that several of the people who are tuning in today have heard me do previous presentations. So today I'd like to do something a little different. I had the library send me a list of questions. And today I'm not going to do a talk. I'm just going to answer questions. And we'll see how it goes. If I answer all the questions too fast, then we'll all just hang up and be done. But first I have to say, the very first question on this list, question number 1, you are a very prolific writer. What do you think explains why you are so prolific? Well, actually, that is a question that pisses me off. Long ago, I was growing up as one of 7 kids in our family. It was the 50s. It was before the pill. And one of my older sisters got in a family way. And leading up to the shotgun wedding, she and her husband-to-be were required to take marriage counseling courses. So they went to see the pastor at our church, the Warren Community Church in Bisbee. And the church at that point had a new minister and also a new minister's wife. So during one of the the marital counseling, that premarital counseling, that the horse had already left the barn. So I thought it was a little too late for that to begin with. But during one of their counseling sessions, the minister's wife turned to my sister and said, my 16-year-old sister, and said, my 16-year-old pregnant sister, and said, your mother is so prolific. Hasn't she ever heard of birth control? Okay. If anybody had nerve enough to ask my mother why she had 7 kids, she would have been happy to explain to them which failed birth control device each of us was. But instead of going after my mother, the minister's wife went after my sister. And so whenever somebody calls me prolific, first I have to unpack all of this emotional baggage before I can figure out that they don't really mean it as an insult. And they don't. But I would a lot rather, when you were talking about someone, and I think other authors would like this too, when you're addressing someone who's a writer of many books, why do you call them a productive writer as opposed to a prolific writer? Because prolific implies that you just sort of pop them out. I mean, writing books is easy and duck soup, and it's the word prolific, if you're a writer, is sort of an insult. So beyond that, I know that the person who asked this question really meant you have written a lot of books. And yes, between 1982 and now, I've written more than 60 books. And if you do the math, that's more than 1 book a year. But as to the question of why I write so many books, in our family, I've had 2 husbands, my first husband, the bad one, and my second husband, the good one. I write the books in our family. My husband writes the checks, and he writes checks at a rate of 2 books a year. And as long as I still have him around writing checks, and as long as the gray cells continue to work, I expect to continue to be just as productive an author as I have been in the past. So I hope I haven't truly embarrassed whoever the nice person is who wrote that question, because they didn't really mean to upset me, but that's the way it is. See, that's what happens when I answer questions. Why do you use your initials instead of spelling out your name? Well, let's talk about my name. My first husband. Okay, let's go there. I always wanted to be a writer. From 2nd grade on. In 2nd grade, I encountered the Wizard of Oz books by Frank Baum. And as soon as I realized I didn't care that much about the wizard, what I really cared about was Frank Baum, the guy hiding behind the words, as opposed to the wizard hiding behind the curtain. And so the moment I realized that a living, breathing human being did that, wrote those words, put those words on the page, from 2nd grade on, that's what I wanted to be. And that's what I wanted to do. So after winning that scholarship to the University of Arizona, I enrolled as an English major. What are you going to do if you want to be a writer? And in my junior year, I tried to enroll in the creative writing program. And the professor said, you're a girl. And I said, so? He said, girls become nurses or teachers. Boys become writers. And he wouldn't let me into his class. So I married a guy who was allowed in the class that was closed to me. He got a good grade in the class. He imitated Faulkner and Hemingway primarily by drinking too much and writing too little. He never had anything published. He died of chronic alcoholism at age 42, a year and a half after I divorced him. But in terms of being a husband, he was a dead loss. But from the point of view of a mystery writer, the guy was a gold mine. So no regrets. But let's go back to his name. His name was Jerry Jance. but his last name was spelled Jance. So although it was supposed to be pronounced Jance, it was mostly mispronounced Jank. After he died and went to what I trust was his reward, the kids and I got tired of being Judy, Josh, and Janti Jank. So we went to court and bought a vowel, that E on the end of my name. So people say it Jance like dance instead of Jank like tank. That E cost me $400 in 1983. In about that time, in 1983, I sold my first novel, the first Beaumont book, Until Proven Guilty, to Avon Books. I had written a book that was a very thinly disguised true crime book of an encounter my first husband and I had with a serial killer. See what I mean about the guy being a gold mine. I had written a thinly fictionalized version of that true story, but it never sold to anybody, primarily because it was way too long. It was 1,400 pages. But I found an agent. She told me to cut it in half, and I did. She still couldn't sell it. The editors who turned it down said that the stuff that was fiction was fine. The stuff that was real was unbelievable and would never happen, even though it already had. So my agent said, write something else. And I wrote the first Detective Beaumont book. The Beaumont books are written in the first person through the point of view of a middle-aged male homicide cop. When I sent the manuscript to my agent, the title page said, Until Proven Guilty by Judith A. Jance. But my agent had spent years in publishing in New York, and she knew that there was some bias towards female mystery writers. And so before she ever sent the manuscript off to an editor, she changed the title page to read Until Proven Guilty by J.A. Jance. The second editor who saw that manuscript called her up and said, boy, the guy who wrote Until Proven Guilty is a good writer. And my agent said, well, what would you say if I told you the guy who wrote Until Proven Guilty is a woman? He said, I'd say she was a hell of a good writer. So he bought Until Proven Guilty, not as a standalone, which I thought it was, but as the first book in a series. A year passed, and it was finally, the book turned up in the hands of marketing in New York. And those guys went straight up and turned left, and they said, oh, no. Having a police procedural written by somebody named Judy, that's not going to work. Readers will never accept that. Well, what they really meant was male readers aren't going to accept that. We'd like to use your initials. Well, I'm a girl from a small, tiny mining town in the West. I'm being published by a big New York publisher. I don't care if they want to use my initials. So that's how Judith Ann Jance became J.A. The irony of that is, since 1985, when that first book came out, my next door neighbor on the shelves in bookstores and libraries has always been P.D. James, who had to use her initials for the same reason a generation and a half before I turned up. But the good thing, the really good thing about J.A. Jance is this. I always sign my books in red ink. That's a tradition. It started book number 3, and I'm still doing it 63 books later. Writing J.A. is a lot easier than Judith A. Jance. And so using my initials has literally saved me miles of red ink over the years. Okay, question number 3. You have created some great male characters. Are there any difficulties or challenges involved in creating characters of the opposite gender? Well, let's go back to my first husband. I was with my first husband for 18 years, and I always wondered what made the guys in the bars so much more interesting to him than I was. So I went to the bars with him and I listened to how those guys talked and I paid attention and tried to understand what made them tick. And when it's time to write a Beaumont book, all I do is I send my head back to those bars and I start writing. But the thing that's really interesting is people sometimes say, well, how do you come up with characters? Well, I met J.P. Beaumont on a train. Sounds a little bit like Agatha Christie, but it's absolutely true. I had spent about 6 months trying to write this first fiction book that my agent had suggested, and I simply could not get it to come together. So in 1983, I sent my kids to spring break, to Camp Orcala for spring break. And then I put myself on a train here in Seattle to go to Portland and spend 5 days with my friend Carol Ray from back in my life insurance days. I got on the train, with a stack of blue line notebooks and a fistful of pens. And as this train pulled out of the King Street station, I thought, what would happen if I wrote this book through the detective's point of view? So I got out a pen, I got out a notebook, and I started writing. And I wrote, she might have been a cute kid once. That was hard to tell now. She was dead. Whoa. And the moment I wrote those words, I was in J.P. Beaumont's head. I was walking around the crime scene in his shoes. I was seeing it through his eyes. I was hearing what other people were saying to him. I was hearing what he was saying, but I was also hearing what he was saying. And J.P. Beaumont and I have been author and character ever since. Within just a couple of pages of writing a Beaumont book, I'm back in his sort of curmudgeonly, dry humor world. And it's always fun to meet back up with him. I gave him my birthday. If you have a lot of kids and grandkids, now great grandkids, and you need to remember all these birthdays and anniversaries, well, you add in all the characters from these different series of books. That's a lot of ages to have to remember. So I cheated with Beau because he is my literary firstborn. I gave him my birthday. We were both born on October 27th, 1944. So he has sort of aged over the years. He spent years as a homicide detective for Seattle PD. And then he went to work for the Attorney General's Special Homicide Investigation Team, which it turns out has a very unfortunate acronym. So he worked for shit for years. In the books, that's always a big joke. And his boss at the Special Homicide turned out to be a guy named Harry Ignatius Ball, who always went by the name Harry Eyeball. So if you tell somebody I work for shit and my boss is Harry Eyeball, that's always good for a laugh. But it turns out that one of my husband's relatives back in Missouri was named Harry Eyeball. So it's sort of an in-crowd family joke. The Beaumont books are written in the first person. The Joanna Brady's, the Walkers, and the Allie Reynolds books are all written in the third person. The Walker books are different, written through 7 or 8 points of view. The Allie Reynolds and the Joannas are written in several different points of view as well. So you're not always seeing what's happening just through Joanna's eyes or just through Allie's eyes. I was working on the next Allie Reynolds book. It's called Unfinished Business. It's due out June 1st. And by the way, the Walkers, the Beaumonts, and the Bradys all belong to HarperCollins. That's my one publishing house. The Alleys belong to Simon and Schuster, my other publishing house. And, talk about the Hatfields and McCoys. So I was working on Unfinished Business, and I realized that the case I was talking about had bases in both Arizona and in a cold case from Washington State. Well, that's what Bo is doing now that he's retired from SHED. He is working cold cases for a volunteer forensics organization. And I thought, I have this perfectly good character who would be able to work on this case. And so I negotiated a peace treaty with my two publishers for the HarperCollins character to come visit the Allie Reynolds character. The Allie books are written in the third person. I assumed, erroneously it turns out, that when Bo turned up in Unfinished Business, he turned up in the third person too. Boy, was I wrong about that. Bo turned up in all his first person curmudgeonly glory, and he wouldn't go away. So I finally said, okay, I give up. Have it your way. I'll write it that way. I did, and I sent it to my editor, who was a new editor who had never read any of the Beaumont books. And she went through the manuscript and changed all of the Beaumont pieces from first person to third person. And when I read it, it was amazing to see that in that process of his going from first person to third person, he became a paper cutout. He was no longer this vital, walking, talking, breathing character. And I wrote back to the editor and said, look, either Bo goes into this in the first person or you're not getting this book. So he's in Unfinished Business in first person, and we'll see how readers accept it. Okay, on to my next question. Are there any difficulties or challenges involved in creating? There's a challenge involved in creating a character of any gender. It doesn't matter. Creating characters is hard work. You need to know everything about them. Right now, I'm working on the next Beaumont book, and it has to do with characters that turned up in Beaumont number 14, Breach of Duty. Well, when I wrote that book, I had no idea that all these years later I was going to be reusing some of those. So I had to go back and recreate the history, parents, grandparents, those kids' birthdays, how old they were in Breach of Duty, how old they are now. And that's the thing about characters. You need to know everything about them. For J.P. Beaumont, for example, I know he was raised by a mother who was an unwed mother dating from World War II. I know they lived in an apartment over a bakery. I know he never had any pets. I know he drank too much. I wonder where that came from. So I've used things from my history to help create his history. For Joanna Brady, when it was time to write a series, what happened is I could never be Sue Grafton and embark on a program to write 26 books about one character in a row, one after one. My attention span doesn't span that far. So by the time I had written 9 Beaumont books, I was tired of him. I threatened to knock him off. And my editor said, oh, you remember that first book you wrote, the one nobody ever published? I said, yeah, I remember that book. He said, how about if you rework that and we'll turn that into your first hardback? Well, as I said before, that book was a thinly fictionalized version of an encounter my first husband and I had with a serial killer who murdered people at 20 minutes after 2 on the 22nd day of the month, and half an hour after murdering his third victim, raping her, shooting her, raping her in front of her 2 children, and leaving her to die. He gave my husband a ride home to our house out in the middle of nowhere in the desert. And on the way up to our house, he said, oh, do you leave your wife out here by herself much? And my husband said, well, she's got the dogs. Well, he had no idea he was speaking to a serial killer. But we found out on our way into town that night when we got stopped at a roadblock that there had been a homicide on the reservation, and they were looking for a guy in a green car. My husband said, oh, a guy in a green car. I wonder if that's the guy who gave me a ride home. Well, actually, it was. When we contacted the sheriff's department, their chief homicide detective came out to see us the next day. And when my husband did a composite drawing of the man who had given him a ride home, the little 4-year-old boy said, that's the man who killed my mommy. Well, he killed me. That was on the 22nd of May. With the information my husband provided, the detective was reasonably, he knew who the guy was. He identified the suspect within a matter of days. But then he realized that he was dealing with a serial killer. And he wanted to get all his ducks in a row before he placed the guy in custody. But he was also worried that the incidents were getting closer together. So on the 20th of July, he took my husband with him to San Manuel, where the guy was working. My husband identified him as he got off shift. And on the ride back into town, he admitted to having been to our house on 3 separate occasions in the intervening 60 days. Our house was 30 miles from town in either direction, 2 miles off the highway, 7 miles to the nearest telephone or neighbor. And during that 60 days, I was on the hill by myself for probably 40 of them. I wore a loaded weapon. I was fully prepared to use it. And I did fire it one morning. One morning I fired all 6 shots out the car window at a rapidly retreating rattlesnake who was still laughing when he went up over the wall and disappeared. But I figured if the killer showed up, he would present a larger target, and I was motivated. And actually, I think that's part of the reason I'm able to write police procedurals. In the summer of 1970, I made the interior decision that if it came down to him or me, it was by God going to be him. And once you make that decision in your soul, you can't unring that bell. You've made that decision that you are going to defend yourself to the death if need be. And it helped me understand the split seconds police officers have to make those life and death, shoot, don't shoot decisions. But when I was getting ready to write this book, rework the first book and turn it into a new book, that killer was then and still is in prison in Florence, Arizona. And although my husband was a witness in that case, I didn't want to write a book that would draw his attention to me. So I had a problem. They had given me a check to write a book. They had given me, I'd signed a contract. They'd given me a check. I had a deadline. And I had no idea who the bad guy was going to be in this book, which gave me a terrible case of writer's block. It was awful. It was so bad that year when my University of Arizona alumni magazine showed up, I read the whole thing from cover to cover. And right at the back was this little boxed article that said the newly reconstituted creative writing program at the University of Arizona was just going swimmingly. So I turned to Bill and I said, I graduated from there and I've got all these books out. Maybe they'd like me to come be writer in residence for a semester in the sun. He said, call him up, ask him. Well, I sold life insurance for 10 years. I'm not afraid of a cold call. So I got the phone number from information. It was the old days. I called him up. I introduced myself. I told him who I was, when I graduated, what I did, and wouldn't they like me to come be writer in residence? And he said, oh, we don't do anything with genre fiction here. We only do literary fiction. Oh, well, I have to tell you, it was a miracle. I was healed of writer's block on the spot. And I went to work writing Hour of the Hunter. In that book, the main protagonist, Diana Ladd, is a teacher on the reservation, but she really wants to be a writer. Like me, she had a husband who was allowed in a creative writing program that was closed to her. Her husband is dead at the beginning of the book. And as for the crazed killer, it turns out to be a former professor of creative writing from the University of Arizona. So here is an important tip. If you have friends or relations who are becoming mystery writers, don't make them mad, because we all have our ways of getting even. Okay, so I don't think, where do I get ideas for plots of your novels? I write police procedurals. And I've been a student of police procedures for decades. When I started writing about Beaumont in the early 80s, yes, they could find fingerprints at crime scenes, but the only fingerprints they had to compare them to were the fingerprints on the cards in that jurisdiction's particular department. Yes, they could find blood samples, but all they could do with that blood was type it. There was no DNA. There was no APIS, automated fingerprint identification system. There was no CODIS, the combined DNA invest. So I've been studying forensic science in the background for all this time. And one of the things I've done is I've watched countless episodes of true crime stories on HLN and ID Discovery. And I've learned a lot about DNA in the process. So about 2 years ago, on a program called Web of Evil, I saw an episode where this young woman, a 16-year-old girl in Scottsdale, began having an internet relationship with a guy she thought was an 18-year-old college student who, over time, encouraged her to take nude selfies of herself and send them. But this guy wasn't an 18-year-old college student. He was a middle-aged predator. And when she tried to break off the relationship, he threatened to post her pictures all over the internet. She attempted suicide. Luckily, her mother figured it out, brought the police in, and the guy was caught. But I watched that, and that episode sort of sat in the back of my head. I didn't think, oh, that's something I'm going to put in a Joanna Brady book. It was just sitting there in what my husband calls my whirring blender. He says I have a whirring blender inside my head. And so here's Joanna. When we met Joanna first in Desert Heat, she was in her late 20s. In that initial scene, she is at home with her mother, Eleanor Lathrop, her widowed mother, Eleanor, and Joanna's 9-year-old daughter, Jenny. Jenny is a bright little kid. And at her school, Greenway School, which I attended, by the way, they've just had a bit of sex education. And they're all waiting there for Jenny's father, Andy, to come home so he and Joanna can go out to celebrate their 10th wedding anniversary. And Eleanor is there to take care of Jenny while they go out to dinner. So they're waiting. And Jenny turns to her mom and says, "Mom, was I a preemie? Because in that sex education class, she's found out how long babies take. And she has counted on her fingers, and there aren't quite enough months between her birthday and her parents' 10th anniversary." Well, of course, she was not a preemie. The baby was on time. The wedding was late, as often happens. And it's like she threw a hand grenade into the conversation, because Eleanor has been on Joanna's case for all these years, because Joanna got pregnant and had to get married when she was still in high school. Of course, we don't find out until several books later that Joanna's parents also had a baby out of wedlock and gave it up for adoption before they got married and had Joanna. So when I wrote that, it is something that it's a string, it's a thread that goes all through all of the books. But did I plan that? No. And that's one of the other questions. How do you plan your books? Do you have an overarching plan for your books? No, I do not. I met outlining in Mrs. Watkins' 6th grade geography class at Greenway School. I hated outlining then. Nothing that happened to me in the intervening decades has changed my mind about outlining. For one thing, I have a terminal fear of Roman numerals. But I don't outline my books, and I don't outline my series either. I write murder mysteries, so I usually start with somebody dead, and then I spend the rest of the book trying to figure out who did it and how come. If I knew when I sat down to write a book exactly what was going to happen in the book, I would have no reason to write it, because I write books for the same reason people read books, and that is to find out what happens. Are any of your characters your favorite or favorites? Well, Bo, as I said, is my firstborn, and I have a very soft spot in my heart. I now have 2 favorite Beaumont books. In Second Watch, the book starts with him on his way to have a bilateral knee replacement surgery. And while he's hopped up on drugs, he has a vivid dream in which his commanding officer from Vietnam appears to him. And he's in his hospital room, and he opens his eyes, and here's this guy in Vietnam era fatigues looking out the window at the Space Needle. Well, the problem was that from that side, if that side of the hospital is the wrong side to be able to see the Space Needle. So obviously there was a problem there. And the guy turns around, and as he walks toward him, Bo realizes who it is. And he walks up to Bo and looks at Bo and says, "You got old." And of course, that's the problem with the commanding officer. He didn't get old. He died a few months before his 23rd, weeks before his 23rd birthday. But that commanding officer, it turns out, is a real person, was a real person. He was a year ahead of me at Bisbee High School. He was a brilliant student, an outstanding athlete. He was handsome. He was smart. Doug Davis was the only kid at Bisbee High School who read all the volumes of Gibbon's Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire. I mean, we in the mornings, Mrs. Philippi, we'd be standing out in the breezeway waiting for Mrs. Philippi to unlock the door, and Doug and I would go in almost simultaneously. He'd go straight to history, I'd go straight to fiction. But Doug was the valedictorian of his class. He went from Bisbee High to West Point. He went from West Point to Ranger School to Vietnam, and he never came home. And I didn't hear that he was dead until I was working out of town that summer. And I didn't find out he was gone until my mother wrote to say that he had died and the funeral had been held at St. Patrick's Church in Bisbee. And I always felt really guilty that I hadn't attended his funeral. Over the course of my years of writing, I happened to encounter a woman named Bonnie Abney. And Bonnie Abney was engaged to marry Doug at the time he died, and Bonnie and I became friends. So it was Thanksgiving dinner. We're all sitting around here in the dining room, and my son, Tom, turns to me and he says, "You know, Mom, Beaumont's getting pretty long of tooth. Have you ever thought about writing a J.P. Beaumont prequel?" And I said, "No, Tom, I've never thought about writing a prequel." But months later, when it was time to write the next Beaumont book, that was the only idea I had, was to write a prequel. And so I thought about how old he was and how old I am. And then I remembered Doug Davis. And I thought, what would happen if I had those two meet and interact in Vietnam? So I called Bonnie and I asked her, what would she think if I entwined Doug's real story with Beau's fictional one? And she said, "Well, let me think about that for a few days." So she finally called me back several days later, and she said, "I think my Douglas would be safe in your hands." And so that became the background story to Second Watch. And Bonnie was, in real life, Bonnie was the girlfriend. So the flag from Doug's casket went to Pina Cook, Doug's mother. But in the book, Beau realizes that part of his problem is that he never searched Bonnie out and told her what knowing Doug had meant to him, or given her his condolences. And finally he tracks her down, and he takes Bonnie and her dog to Bisbee for a ceremony. There's on the high school campus, right across the drive from the flagpole, is the Bisbee High Vietnam Memorial with 7 names on it, and Doug's is at the top of the list. And so in the book, at the end of the book, Beau takes Bonnie to Bisbee for a Veterans Day ceremony. And when they lower the flag, they play taps and they lower the flag and the Boy Scout troop holds it up and they gave it to Bonnie. Well, that was fine for Bonnie to have a flag, at least in fiction. But later, Bill and I went to Bisbee High School and we bought them a new flag and had them retire the old flag. And now Bonnie has her own flag. So writing that book was magical. It almost wrote itself. And if you read Second Watch, don't miss the afterword about the story behind Second Watch, because it was one little miracle after another. But a couple of years ago, on the 50th anniversary of Doug's death, Bonnie went to Bisbee and spent most of the day at Doug's gravesite. And what she learned was that people who had read the book had found their way to Bisbee, found their way to the cemetery, located Doug's grave, and left behind tokens of their esteem. And so I no longer have to feel guilty about not attending that funeral. I realized halfway through that story that I started telling you a different story. And that's what happens when you don't outline speeches. I was talking about meeting Jenny for the first time in Desert Heat, all of those books ago. Well, when it came time to write the book that's out right now, Missing and Endangered, that's when that Web of Lies episode from a couple of years ago came to mind. But we've all, as writer and readers, we watched Jenny grow up. We watched her get her first horse. We watched her compete in rodeos. She's now attending Northern Arizona University on a rodeo scholarship. And I thought, she is a remarkable young woman. She wouldn't fall for this kind of web-based nonsense. She's too smart for that. So instead, I brought in a different character as her roommate, this very highly intelligent, but completely socially inept young woman who is sucked into that kind of relationship. And this book is as much Jenny's book in many ways as it is Joanna's. But that's the advantage of writing a series of books. At least that's what I feel. You're able to watch characters grow and change over the years. Bo was a lush when I met him. And actually, it took me several years to point it out. And it didn't happen until my readers started saying, Beaumont has a problem. And finally, when enough of them got my attention, he did end up going into treatment. And he's been sober now for a lot more books than he was drinking. I do have readers who tell me they liked him better when he was drunk. I worry about those folks, but that's the way that is. And I wanted to tell you I mentioned the whirring blender in my head, and I have a perfect example of how the whirring blender works. Years ago, my older sister had, this was back in the late 50s and early 60s. My older sister and her husband had this little ranchette outside Bisbee. And on this little ranch, they had a horse named Warpaint, a cow named Shirley, a pig named Oscar, and a dog named Smokey Joe. Smokey Joe was an Australian Shepherd. Warpaint was really smart, and he understood that if it rained, the electric fence would quit working and he could let everybody out, and he did. Well, Smokey Joe could be counted on to help round out Oscar and Shirley. But if Warpaint was out in the pasture, if you came up with anything that resembled a rope, he wouldn't let you get anywhere near him. So one day, my sister came home from work. Sure enough, it had rained. Everybody was out. So Smokey Joe helped her get Oscar and Shirley back corralled. And then my sister went out to the pasture and she walked out there with absolutely nothing in her hand. She walked up to War Paint. She sort of snuggled up under his chin and was just sort of loving on him. But while she was doing that, she reached up under her t-shirt, slipped off her bra, wrapped it around his neck, and led him home. Poor War Paint. The world had suddenly shifted on his axis and he could no longer trust anybody to not have a bridle. So years later, I'm writing a book called Skeleton Canyon, Joanna Brady, #5. And she's out in Skeleton Canyon. She's pinned down by gunfire. She needs to create a diversion. So what does she do? She whips off her bra and she uses it as a slingshot. Now, I cannot explain to you exactly how my sister using her bra as a bridle and Joanna's using her bra as a slingshot. The only common denominator is the wearing blender in my head. You have written several novellas. Why do you write novellas? I wrote novellas because my editors asked me to write novellas. They were supposed to be the next big thing. Well, my problem is I tell stories. And even if it's a novella, I need to be able to tell a story in that novella. And in one of those novellas, Random Acts, I put in a portion of the whole story that was far too important. And many of my readers missed it because it was the death of Joanna Brady's mother and stepfather when they're gunned down in a random act of violence by a freeway shooter. And so novellas were supposed to be teasers for the next book, but they showed up in paperbacks. Well, the people who read hardbacks had already read that book, so they never saw the teaser. And so don't look for any more novellas. I won't be writing any more of those. They were a thing and they have gone away. What is the most difficult part of the writing process? The hardest part of writing a book is starting a book. If you read a series, you're walking a tightrope because you have to introduce all the characters. You have to introduce the new characters who are in that book, but you also have to introduce old characters in a way that makes new readers feel at home while not boring longtime readers to tears. So the first 20% of writing a book is the most difficult part. The middle 60% is marginally easier. I count the words every day. I know my book is supposed to be between 95,000 words and 105,000 words. The thing is, 100,000 words is the magic number because that's how many books fit in a standard packing box. So they'll let you be 5,000 under. If you're 7,000 under, then they have to start spacing the book, the type, and it looks like it's been double spaced. If you go way over 100,000, then they have to start making the print smaller because they're going to stick to that standard packing box. So when I'm writing a book, I aim for 95,000. I know that 95,000 will be enough. And when I hit 95,000, I'm finished. And I may add stuff and take stuff away in the course of the editing process. But that's always my goal. And as of yesterday afternoon, at 5:52 p.m., I crossed the 50% mark in the next Beaumont book I'm writing, which is called Nothing to Lose. Don't ask me when the pub date is. I don't know. But I count the word. So the last 20% of the book is the part of the book I call the banana peel, because I've been writing all the way up, and now I can see where the book is going. I finally know who the killer is usually, and I can finish the story at that point. And so from that point of the book on, whether you're the writer or the reader, you're going to keep going until you finish that book. That's why people stay up really late reading mysteries. They hit the banana peel and they don't want to go to sleep. So when I started writing, I was a single parent with those two little kids. And writing a book is sort of, a lot of time is spent just sort of staring off into space. That's kind of unsettling if the person staring into space happens to be your mom. But when I would finish writing a book, then I'd gather up the kids and we'd go out for a celebratory dinner. That's one of the questions. What do you do? How do you celebrate when you finish a book? Well, now you know, we go out to dinner. We also celebrate hitting the New York Times list. And when I hit the New York Times list, we're going out to dinner, but I'm sure the creative writing professor who wouldn't let me into his class and my first husband are both spinning wildly in their graves. I am not a nice person. But the kids caught on that when I was done with the book, we were going to get to go out to dinner. So they started asking me, Mom, are you on the banana peel yet? Well, then my daughter was a senior in high school here in Bellevue. And one day at school, there was a food fight. And there was food thrown all over the school. And she said, Mom, somebody was walking down the hall and they stepped on a banana peel and down they went. And now I understand why you say that. Sometimes it takes years to decode what it is your mother was saying. How many drafts of a book do you usually write? I write one book. I start at the beginning. I write to the end. I edit as I go along. I write a chapter one day. I edit that chapter, and then I go on. I don't go back to the beginning to edit, because if I went back to the beginning to edit, I would have a wonderful beginning, and I would never get to the end of the book. When I get to the end of the book, it's finished. I send a copy to my agent. I still have that same agent I had in 1983. She didn't sell my first book, but she's sold all of my books since then. A lot of beginning writers make a terrible error. If they get an agent for their first manuscript, if the agent isn't able to sell that first manuscript, they keep the manuscript and fire the agent. I did the opposite. I fired the manuscript and kept the agent. So it's been the same. She sold more than 60 books in all these years. But I simultaneously give the book to my husband to read, and I give a copy to my agent to read. And then when I get their comments and edits back, I install them, and then I send the book to New York. That's how it works. I don't do one draft and then another draft. And I think doing more than one draft I'd be bored to tears. That I don't work that way. So, but the book has to come to a satisfactory conclusion in my heart before I'll say it's finished. I was writing one book. It was an alley book. And I just couldn't, I was on the banana peel and I couldn't find a way to end the book. And I finally, in desperation, went to my husband and I said, would you please read this and tell me how to end it? And so he read it and he turned to me And this is a direct quote of what he said. He said, "Why don't you do it the easy way?" And so I did. But the questioner asked me if I had somebody I trust to be the beta readers on these. Yes, I do have a trusted pair of readers, and they're really invaluable because they're good enough to tell me if I'm doing something wrong. Are there any authors you enjoy reading? Yes, I read. Why did I write mysteries? Well, I've always enjoyed mysteries. So I read the Jack Reachers, I read Michael Connelly, I read the Miss Julia books. I read mostly mysteries, but here's the thing, it's really hard for me. I read less now than I did before I was a writer, because it's really hard for me to read someone else's book when I'm supposed to be writing my own. It somehow other people's plots and characters end up infringing on mine. So I don't read as much now as I used to read. So that is the kind of talk you get when when I'm just answering questions. I would like to, this is going to run over a little bit. I hope you'll forgive me. In the late 70s and early 80s, I was living in Phoenix. I was selling life insurance. I was struggling with whether or not I was going to divorce my husband. And if I did divorce him, would I be able to keep a roof over my kids' heads? Would I be able to keep food on the table? And so I drove from appointment to appointment, listening to the music of Gordon Lightfoot. Cobwebs and dust, cobwebs and dust. I hate to leave you, but leave you I must. And Helen Reddy, I am woman, hear me roar in numbers too big to ignore. And then there was the music of Janice Ian. The lyrics to her songs just went straight to my heart. And there was one especially, as soon as I heard at 17, I was there, because you can't tell this when I'm sitting down, but I'm 6'1". I was 6 feet tall by the time I was in 7th grade. I wore thick glasses. I was smart. That was a dead certain recipe for social failure in junior high and high school. So as soon as I heard that song, I thought, boy, she and I have walked in the same moccasins. But then I found out Janice is only 4'10". When we're together, she barely comes to my shoulder, to say nothing of, it's more like my elbow. But that song really spoke to me. And so for years, when I've done events, I have closed my presentation by singing that song. In 2008, I had agreed to be the keynote speaker at a writers' conference in Boise, Idaho. That was happening in June. My husband's bilateral knee replacement surgery, which I used in Second Watch, had been scheduled for August. Suddenly, it got moved up to June. So now the day he was going to be released to rehab was the day I was supposed to be in Boise. So I said to my daughter, I'm just going to call the writers' conference. I'm going to say, my husband is in the hospital. I'm sorry, I can't come. And they said, Mom, you gave your word. We'll look after Dad. You go keep your promise. Oh, doesn't it annoy you when suddenly your kids start spouting back the words you've always said to them? And so, muttering under my breath, I went to Boise. I did my presentation Saturday at noon, and I closed by singing Janice's song. Sunday evening, I came back home. I opened my computer, and there was an email from Janice Ian. She said, "Hey, I heard you sang my song in Boise yesterday, and that you did a good job of it." Well, it turned out that someone who was a fan of my work and a fan of her work was in the audience in Boise. And she went straight back to Nashville and tattled on me. And that's how Janice Ian and I became friends. So a few years ago at a Tampa News book festival, Janice and I actually sang that song together as a duet. That wasn't easy. Janice still has her full vocal range. And she said, "Judy, you sing in the key of R." But here, in the key of R, is Janice Ian's iconic song. I learned the truth at 17, that love was meant for beauty queens and high school girls with clear skin smiles who married young and then retired. The Valentines I never knew, the Friday night, a brown-eyed girl in hand-me-downs whose name I never could pronounce, said, "Pity please the ones who serve, they only get what they deserve." A rich relation, hometown queen, marries into what she needs with a guarantee of company, haven for the elderly. Remember those who win the game, lose the love they sought to gain, in debentures of quality and dubious integrity. The small town eyes will gape at you in dull surprise when payment due exceeds accounts received at 17. For those of us who learned the pain of Valentines that never came, for those whose names were never called when choosing sides for basketball. We all played the game, and when we dare, we cheat ourselves at solitaire, inventing lovers on the phone, repenting other lives unknown, who called to say, "Come dance with me," and murmur vague obscenities at ugly girls like me at 17. It was long ago and far away. The world was younger than today, and dreams were all they gave for free to ugly duckling girls like me. And thanks to my readers, my dreams have all come true.
Thank you so much. That was just wonderful. And I think I speak for a lot of people who say that that story of the ugly duckling is really true. The ugly duckling becomes a beautiful swan. And I really want to thank you on behalf of the library and all the listeners and readers for being so generous with your time. This is a wonderful talk. And we are going to be, it's been recorded, and we'll be posting it to the library website. And so people can come back and listen to it again. And anybody that wasn't able to join us today will be able to listen to your words at their leisure then. So thank you so much. This was wonderful.
And thank you for the questions.
Well, I want to thank the people that wrote the questions. So yes, you should think about doing this, doing this format again, because it's wonderful. I mean, you can talk about whatever you want to talk about in the context of the questions. And
By the way, if people want to get in touch with me, my website is, my email address is posted on my website. I have a weekly blog, which posts every Friday. When I went away to college, my mother, despite having all of those kids at home and clothes to wash and hang on the line, every week she wrote me a letter. And my weekly blog is sort of my weekly letter to my readers, and it posts on Friday morning. This week's blog is all about my best friend from 4th grade who suffered a stroke last week, and because her her hand wasn't working. She left her phone in the car when she crawled into the house and then was on the floor for 24 hours. And my blog is about the importance of keeping, if you're alone or out walking or doing something solitary, the importance of having the ability to call for help. So the blog has nothing to do with the books most of the time. It's mostly to do with my life and times.
Great. I'll look for that. So thank you very much again.